This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen kicks off the show with points from cases that may impact farmers and ranchers and what they should consider doing. Tawnie Larson, project consultant for the Kansas Agriculture Safety and Health Program, continues the show as she talks about farm safety and how people can help keep kids safe. The show concludes with K-State's Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, and Bob Larson with another segment from the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast about the different feedstuffs producers can graze during the summer. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking about things related to agricultural law with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, talking about a handful of different cases today, and the first one starting off a case when it comes to motorists and a liability with tree limbs.
Yeah, this is an issue that comes up periodically, and the question is, am I responsible as a farmer for things on my farm that can create problems to people that are passing by, say, on a public roadway adjacent to my farm? And I get into this issue with people that will ask me questions concerning crops that are planted close to the roadway. What's my responsibility there? If I'm planting, for example, a tall crop such as corn, do I need to back it off a bit? How close to a corner can I plant? Is there any rule with respect to that? And then what about vegetation? Is it my responsibility to make sure that a tree doesn't fall on the road, that there aren't limbs that could come down and cause a traffic hazard, those types of things? And the general rule is no, you don't have a responsibility for things that could happen off premises. It doesn't mean you shouldn't exercise common sense, but the general rule is no, if you've got a tree, for example, that falls and it falls on a road and injures somebody, you're not responsible for that because that's something that occurred off premises and you're not responsible for that even though the tree was on your premises. There are exceptions, of course, but the general rule is no, and the same thing applies with respect to crops and vegetation.
And this was a recent case in Texas of why it kind of got brought back up again this time?
Yeah, that's right. It came up in an East Texas case. There was a windstorm that uprooted a large oak tree on a farm, and it fell across a road. Well, the driver hit the tree and sued for her injuries, and she claimed that the farmer failed to inspect the premises of the farm to ensure that objects on the farm were not a hazardous to roadway motorists. And the farmer pointed out, said, look, there was no evidence. I didn't have any evidence that the tree was rotten or there was a problem with it. And the farmer actually produced an affidavit from an arborist that said that the tree was healthy, had no outward signs of decay, and would have required a tremendous wind to blow it down, which indeed is what happened. But again, this ended up in court.
What happened once it did get to court?
Well, the court ruled for the farmer, and again, it's the general rule. There is no duty to parties that are injured off premises because the landowner is not in possession and control of those areas. But while the court said that a landowner doesn't have a duty to make an adjoining road safe or to warn travelers of potential danger, the court indicated that there can be exceptions to that, but none of those exceptions applied in the case. And again, I go back to what I said earlier, and the court pointed this out. This was a farm that was in a rural area. There was no evidence that the farmer knew or should have known of the danger posed by the tree, and it wasn't evident by simply looking at the tree. And in addition, motorists have a duty to drive according to the conditions, and that includes being able to spot a large oak tree that's blocking both lanes of a road in time to avoid hitting it.
And Roger, also wanted to mention something else that's kind of taking place in agriculture quite a bit, solar panels and how zoning plays a big role in that.
That's right. It's not dissimilar to where we were at with respect to wind energy 30 years ago when a lot of county and local municipalities didn't have rules in place that would put any type of restrictions in the way of the development of those. And so that's where we're at largely with solar panels. Many of the local zoning rules leave the door wide open to the potential for farmland to be converted into usage for solar panels, and there's no extra step that's required to go from ag to solar. And this is a commercial use, and normally when you change a use of property from ag to non-ag, there's a zoning step that you have to go through. And some of these solar panels are getting put on prime farmland. That's another concern also. But on the zoning issue, one study has forecast that 83% of solar energy development is going to be on farmland and ranch land unless current governmental policies are changed, and about half of that amount is projected to be on the nation's most productive soil. So, in my view, local zoning and planning commissions need to be at the forefront of this issue because rezoning or permitting should be necessary to convert farmland to solar fields. That's an industrial use, and traditionally, as I indicated, a change in classification involves a public process, and so the public should be involved in this.
Roger, another important case really taking place in agriculture when it comes to things that could impact farmers. Supreme Court has recently made a decision on buy-sell agreements.
Yeah, actually, we've had several very significant U.S. Supreme Court opinions that bear on agriculture in one way or another. And what they said with respect to a buy-sell agreement, and by the way, I think a buy-sell agreement is perhaps just as important as a properly drafted will or trust, particularly if you're planning on keeping that farm in the family throughout subsequent generations. You need a good buy-sell agreement, particularly if you have both on-farm and off-farm heirs. What we had in this situation was a small business in the St. Louis area. It's non-farm, but the same principle applies. And it was two brothers that operated the business, and they had a buy-sell agreement where the corporation would redeem the stock of a deceased shareholder. There would be a redemption. And the insurance policy that was funding the buy-sell agreement, those proceeds would go to the corporation to redeem the stock of the deceased shareholder. One of the shareholders died, the one that owned most of the stock, and so the corporation gets over $3 million worth of insurance proceeds for the other brother to buy out his deceased brother. Well, the question was, does the policy proceeds increase, or do the policy proceeds increase the stock base and then cause a tax problem in the deceased brother's estate? And the court said, yes, it did in this situation. Now, they said it wouldn't necessarily be the case in every redemption-style buy-sell agreement, but the brothers didn't pay attention to what was required under the buy-sell agreement during life, and so the lower courts felt that they didn't have to pay attention to it after death, and the Supreme Court said that was right. So there are a lot of details that I'm kind of glossing over on that, but it does point out to us the peril, perhaps, in using a redemption-style buy-sell agreement and the need to use what we call a cross-purchase agreement, maybe with also an insurance LLC, and that's a really complex topic. But for our purposes today, I think we just need to raise the attention that maybe that plain vanilla redemption-style buy-sell agreement is not the way to go anymore.
Another topic wanting to bring to the attention of people, especially our farmers and ranchers, the repeal of the Chevron doctrine, something that's been around for 40 years.
This is huge. The Chevron doctrine comes from a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1984, and under that doctrine, courts are to defer to an administrative agency's interpretations of a statute where the intent of the Congress was ambiguous and where the interpretation is reasonable or permissible. So that set a pretty low hurdle for an agency to clear. If the agency's interpretation of a statute wasn't arbitrary or capricious or manifestly contrary to the statute, then the agency's interpretation would be upheld. Well, farmers and ranchers get into a lot of agency snags. USDA has various branches. NRCS, for example, is one that farmers deal with constantly, and there are a lot of regulations out there. If you're in the Federal Farm Program, there is a huge manual that the FSA uses that has all their rules and regs in it, and it's their interpretation of what the existing law is. And under the Chevron doctrine, if they were reasonable in their interpretation, they win. And that has created issues for farmers and ranchers for a long time. Now the court said, no, that's not right. And one of the things that the court said was these agencies don't have any special competence on construing statutes. The courts do. And so this kicks it back to the courts to determine ambiguous statutes. And I think it'll have an impact on how the agencies write their rules and the administrative process. And I think it'll have an impact there. But we'll see what happens because it's going to be up to the courts now to construe congressional language, not the administrative agencies.
What could this mean for farmers and ranchers?
Well, I think it has a couple of impacts. I think it'll have an impact on the administrative agency review process. but it'll also have an impact on how the agencies write their rules. They're going to have to pay much closer attention to the statute, the legislative history, and what the intent of the Congress was, and stay very close to that, or they will get overturned. And again, on the backside, I think if a farmer gets into a snag with an administrative agency and you go through the administrative agency review process, I think it'll have an impact on that review process too. But the way the rules get written is going to be the primary impact of the court's decision.
And Roger, rounding out today's conversation, making a mention of some things that have been happening when it comes to water compacts.
Yeah, this is another U.S. Supreme Court opinion that came down in June, and this involves specifically the Rio Grande Compact that was signed back in 1938 between Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas. And it had to do with how the states would apportion water out of the Rio Grande Basin. And this has ended up in litigation. About a decade ago, Texas sued New Mexico for allowing the water in the river to be channeled away for its use, which deprived Texas of its equal share of the water under the compact. And, of course, you got the federal government that's involved in this, too, because they have to fulfill treaty obligations to Mexico with water in the Rio Grande. So the question was, after the 2014 litigation, Texas and New Mexico tried to do their own agreement, say, we're going to settle this thing, we're going to come into our own agreement, but they didn't include the federal government. Federal government has to be involved when they have an interest such as this. The Constitution says the states can compact, but the Congress must approve, and that's what the Supreme Court said. The federal government has a role and has a say in this compact. Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Thank you, Shelby. That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will link articles in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you'd like to read more about these topics. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead.
Tuned back into Agriculture Today. We continue the show by discussing farm kid safety with project consultant for the Kansas Agriculture Safety and Health Program, Tawnie Larson. Tawnie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me today.
Tawnie, to kick off our discussion, would you differentiate between the two types of children on farms and ranches?
So there's really two categories that we look at when you think about children on the farm, and there's the working children and then the non-working children. So that could be any age, as long as they're old enough, 10 and older usually start to do some things on the farm safely. But the younger children are the ones that we often think about are non-working. And those are the ones that we have to take special care to keep them safe.
How often are children injured when working on the farm?
Unfortunately, throughout the U.S., there are about 33 injuries a day with children under 20 years old. And especially in our industry of farming, a lot more children than any other industry are injured or there's fatalities.
What are some of the most dangerous areas on a farm or ranch?
So most of the places and things that we see that would cause injury or even fatalities are being around equipment, heavy equipment. The younger children, the non-working children, the rates are higher related to tractors and large equipment. And then also we see a lot of drownings on farms. And it's just mainly if there's not barriers around those things to keep them safe and good communication with everybody that is on the farm and in the family. If there's a lot of equipment moving around that day, maybe the kids shouldn't be outside.
Does where children play impact their safety?
I think we have to look at how we design a safety area for the kids. And so you want it to be away from where there may be cutting crops or where the machinery is at. We really need to pay close attention to what's happening in the environment. So one thing that we see a lot of, and it may be play, but it's also a necessity for parents to have their children with them. Maybe when they're cutting, the kids are in the combine. I see on social media all the time babies in little baby carriers. And, it's tough because there's not really very many other choices. But what's happening to those kids when they're in that environment? So things are flying in the air, things are getting cut, there's loud noise, there's vibration. And we know that, hearing protection is cumulative. So if you start out, when you're really young, your parents need to be protecting you. And we don't know yet about the vibration and what really happens. We know in adults, vibration causes fatigue, and you might feel really tired at the end of the day when you just are like, I sat in a tractor all day and don't know why I'm tired. But with small children, we just don't know yet what happens to their brains and their bodies when they're sitting on that floor of that combine for 8 hours.
What are some of the most common instances where children are injured when working on the farm, and how do you prevent them from happening?
So the children that are working on the farm, again, it's tractors. Tractors is the leading cause of injury and death on farms of all ages. So if a youth is working on the farm, they can use a tractor that has a ROPS device, which is a roller protection structure, and wear their seatbelt. And it would even be better probably if it was in a cab because that protects them a little bit more. But the seatbelt part is an important part of the equation because with the roll bar, it would keep the tractor from rolling over, but the seatbelt keeps them in place. So they're in a little protected box. So I think using the proper PPE, adult supervision, checking in on those kids while they're out there, maybe it's every hour, but making sure that they're just in touch with you so you know they're doing fine. Taking away the distractions like the phones and music and maybe having somebody else, a friend or whatever, ride with them. Let's take those away because this is their job and we don't get to play with our friends, when we're working. So if you kind of can think about what is their capacity to work also. So just because it might be, say, a bigger kid or a taller kid, that doesn't mean that his mind is developed as much. And you could have a 7-year-old that you think you can send him out to do anything. He's great. He's strong. But there might be some issues maybe with following instructions or following rules that you've set. Well, maybe you've got a smaller kid that follows rules just no matter what. He is straight on the line that you want him to be. And so you have to make that choice and that decision. They're not many adults. So just because they might look capable doesn't mean that they have that capability yet.
If an unfortunate accident does take place, what should parents do after?
Farm families are very private. And so, of course, you would want to get your child to seek medical help right away. But some things would be like afterwards is to just think about how this happened and how we can avoid something like this happening in the future. Throughout the U.S., there are safety centers, and we often have people that have lost a child that is part of the safety programming, and then they would like to share the information about what's happened to their children. So sometimes that can be healing. It might take a little while longer, but there's a program right now that a woman lost her child. He was messing around with the gas can, and then he lit a match, and the fumes caught fire, and he passed away. So she does a lot of programming around safe gas cans. Something you wouldn't think about, but it's very, very important. And if the way I look at things like that is if it saves one child or one person, it is worth the whole program. So I think it's just being aware, maybe getting support from your neighbors. But people don't usually report a lot of accidents or incidents that happen on a farm. So sometimes we don't even hear about them.
How should parents appropriately integrate young children into farm activities as they become a young adult?
So I think it's a matter of each individual person. And I think that's really important for parents to realize that not all their children are the same. And just because the neighbor down the road is driving a tractor doesn't mean that their kid is ready. Making sure that they do have that training, that kids usually can do something like, say, drive the grain cart or whatever. Well, they're really good at that, or driving the tractor, because that isn't really too hard. The issue that we usually have is cognitively, they are not ready for that if something happens. Like brain surgery is pretty easy, right? Because everything's supposed to be in its place. But just like driving a tractor. But when it's not, that's when you need the person that has the most experience and training. And so I think it is just on an individual basis. And, start with the little kids. I mean, they can be picking up sticks. They can be doing little things, maybe collecting eggs or something. And then just kind of see how they progress.
Tawnie, a big part of being safe on a farm or ranch is following the recommendations for the amount of passengers in a vehicle. Why are these guidelines so important for parents and children to follow?
Absolutely. So some tractors have a training seat, and that's usable, and that usually works pretty well. for training. The biggest issue that we have is having extra riders. There's been a lot of injuries and fatalities when there's a child being held and they're driving the tractor. And sadly, this happens more often than we know.
Can physical visibility play a part into farm kid safety, Tawnie? And if so, how?
So I think you can start this really young, and maybe it's just getting them some blaze orange or blaze yellow safety equipment from, a local store. And here's your day outside. If you're going to go play outside when, dad's out doing harvest, this is your harvest shirt, or whatever they want to do. Of course, there's also needs to be some follow-up with other communication, that kind of thing. But really, kids like to wear special things. And so just make it a special day and a special event. And then also still have your rules and have your barriers, but just making it fun and a part of everyday life on the farm is really important. And, you don't want them to be scared of everything. You want them to be cautious.
Tawnie, what are some of the basic farm safety strategies that children and parents can put into practice?
So there's about 5 different things that we usually look at when we think about our safety strategies. And number 1 is childcare. So let's plan ahead if we can. Get somebody in there to watch the kids so you don't have to worry about them. You can go out, you can work. That would be probably the number 1 thing. And then if they are going to be there and have adults supervise them, having a safe play and recreation area, and just make it someplace that is away from the hazards and protective, and especially if you have kids coming out just to visit. So there might be family non-working, but then you might have non-working visitors. Those kids might not have any idea of what they should do and not to do, and they might be really attracted to something that the kids that are growing up on the farm know they shouldn't go that direction. So really making sure that any child that's on the farm is safe. And then the younger workers receiving the ag safety training, guidance from the parents, the PPE, again, adult supervision. There's always a need for that, pretty much regardless of what they're doing, and it might be just at different levels as they grow older and learn more. And then making sure that all equipment is as safe as possible. So is there a ROPS? Is there a seatbelt? Do you have a guard on the PTO? Because that also causes a lot of injuries. And so don't skip those safety things.
That was Tawnie Larson, project consultant for the CASH, or Kansas Agriculture Safety and Health Program, with how to keep children safe when working on the farm. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now, but we'll be back with more up ahead. Into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we end today's show with Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, and Bob Larson from the Beef Cattle Institute.
The next part, Phillip, we wanted to talk about forage and grazing, and relative to some of the different types of forages we're seeing harvested around this year, whether it's oats or triticale or a few other things. How do I know which of those may be best for my operation?
Lots of different choices out there. So, and it depends on when you want that additional forage. And so planting some things like cool season annual crop, so like triticale or wheat or rye, we plant that in the fall. And if we plant it early enough in the fall, we can get some fall growth and we get some grazing in the fall and early winter. And then we can do a couple different things with it in the spring. We can regraze that spring regrowth, or we can keep the animals off and then hay it so that we've got forage for the next winter or whatever we need to do there. It gives us lots of options.
Any differences in managing that type of hay versus, say, a cool season grass hay?
A little bit. If those plants, when it starts to warm up, they're going to go reproductive fast. And so you have a very short window of trying to get those harvested when it's optimal quality for that forage. And we can do some things like with oats. Oats is another cool season, but we typically plant it in the spring. So generally we're going to we're either going to graze it or we're going to hay it. We're not going to try to do both with it because we're going to plant it in the spring. You're going to get one growth spurt out of it, and so you're going to pick one or the other.
And then as we transition into warmer weather, there are some of those other forages that we may want to switch to because those will be done by this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've got that field that was planted to annual cool season, so we can come right back in this time of year in mid-June, and we can plant an annual warm season. So like Sudan, pearl millet, crabgrass, and there's a newer forage species that's kind of being used a little bit more out there called teff, again, in a warm season annual. And so we can plant some of those this time of year, and then we got options to either graze those or hay those.
Well, one of the things that it seems like from my perspective, and I'm looking at Phillip here, is, over the last couple of decades, people that I really respect as far as forage managers, they're running their cows, but they're really forage managers. They're getting better at grazing, so that might be some sort of a management-intensive grazing or, trying to use their forages as optimally as possible. But they're also looking at some other forages, planted annuals, things like that, or cover crops. All of those seem to have increased over the last couple of decades as far as the options. And so one of my questions would be, how, if I'm a producer, I know how I've done it in the past, but where do I get information about some of these alternative, cover crops, spring annuals, different things like that? Where can I get more information, and how do I learn whether I want to try those or not?
Well, probably the first place I would go would be your county extension office and agent, and talk to them. They can give you some information on those. Try to talk to people that have used those before, so you can kind of get the finer points of how to manage those. Some of those are a little bit difficult to establish. Some of them have issues with grazing and animal toxicities, so different things and understanding those. And then it becomes just probably maybe trying some and trying to figure out what's going to work best in your management system.
Kind of talk to your neighbors and a little bit of trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the important things, and you didn't mention, obviously the internet has some resources on it, right? You can find those. But you'll sometimes find fact sheets that are for different regions of the country, and things like planting date to harvest date will vary greatly depending on where you are. So be sure that if you're doing that, you're not pulling the Michigan fact sheet if you live in Kansas or Oklahoma, right? Because it's going to be a little bit different. So all of those things, great resources there. Thanks, Phillip.
That's all we have for now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more on Friday, July 5th, as there will be no show on Independence Day.